Alexander Zivojinovic.
Alexander, sit down.
It's like the Russian guy. I'm not coming today. No computer problem. No service today for my laundry. It's still not fixed. Been fucking 2 weeks. Welcome to Backtracking, the show where two old friends take a second listen to influential bands' catalogs, track by track. I'm Roth Bagdasarian.
And I'm Dan Fiden. We'll be taking this journey together, providing context, both personal and historical, on some legendary bands. For our first season, we've picked none other than the Canadian power trio, Rush.
Today I'm backtracking Rush, the first step on what will become a long journey, covering 19 original studio albums released over the course of 5 decades. But first, we're going to set the proverbial stage by discussing the history of the Canadian power trio. Singer, bassist, and keyboardist Geddy Lee was born back in 1953 in Ontario, Canada. His birth name is Gershon Weinrib, but he was given the nickname Geddy because that's how his mom, an Eastern European Holocaust survivor, pronounced the anglicized version of his name, Gary. Geddy co-founded Rush with his fellow schoolmate Alex Lifeson after a few previous iterations of the band, some of which omitted Lee altogether. Alex was also born in 1953 to immigrant parents and was given the name Alexander Zivojinovic, which roughly translates in English to the name he uses today. Alex and Geddy played together informally throughout school, but most Rush historians attribute the founding of the band to 1968, when Lee and Lifeson joined with drummer John Rutsey and guitarist-singer Jeff Jones as Hadrian. Lee was eventually tossed from that band, but even after that stinging rebuke, would eventually team up again with Lifeson and Rutsey as Rush. The original trio would stick together through the recording of the band's eponymous debut in 1974.
After a short stint on the road supporting the debut album, Rutsey left the band and was replaced by Neil Peart just weeks before the band was set to embark on their first major tour. The elder Peart, born in 1952, was from St. Catharines, Ontario. At just 18, Peart left his home for London with hopes of making it as a musician, but returned to Canada disappointed after a year and a half. Within days of returning home, however, Rush's manager, that son of a bitch Ray Daniels, paid him a visit and asked him to audition for Rush. The trio clicked instantly. The classic Peart, Lee, Lifeson lineup would remain unchanged for the band's entire career to date. Over the course of that amazing career, the band sold more than 42 million records worldwide, making them one of the top 100 selling artists in U.S. history. They've had 17 albums certified platinum in the U.S., and in 2013 were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Over their 41-year career, Rush developed a reputation as one of rock music's most technically capable and influential bands. They maintained a productive and uniquely undramatic working relationship despite astonishing personal hardships, including the death of Peart's wife and daughter within the span of a single year. Peart died of brain cancer in January of 2020 at the age of 67.
Over the span of this amazing career, Rush watched as the music industry transitioned from vinyl to 8-track to cassette to CD, and then to digital downloads and streaming. They recorded their first album on Analog 8 and their last on an unlimited number of pure digital tracks. When they began the band, tape delays and echo units were common, and the cutting edge of instrument technology was the Minimoog analog synthesizer. But they adapted, adopted, and evolved much better and for much longer than nearly any band in history.
Rush eras. I mean, Rush, like most great bands, can be broken into eras, right? I mean, it's called progressive rock for a reason. So, Dan...
or does it regress, Roth? I guess that's the hot topic that we're going to have to discuss here.
In some cases, I mean, if you like what you get, day one, you might as well stick with it, like the Rolling Stones, for example, right? But...
this is an incredibly interesting topic to me, actually. I think there are some bands that kind of burst forth fully formed and never really progress. But that's okay because
Boston.
like they're so unique and so different. Who did you say? Boston?
I said Boston.
Boston. Boston is not exactly what I was actually thinking of. Now it's probably difficult to compare a band like Rush that, over the course of their career did 20 something, studio records, but one of the bands that I always think of that kind of came out fully formed, never really changed. And that was okay because it was really interesting and good, is Morphine. Do you remember Morphine?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
As
Morphine just kind of, the first record was not all that different than the third record.
Yeah.
And, there are some that are, a little bit better than others, but basically it was the same stuff.
And I should say about Boston, I mean, it was a stroke of genius on Tom Schultz's part, right? So it's like, I don't mean to be knocking Boston, but Boston was Boston. You got what you got.
Yeah.
So this episode is specifically about Rush's eras. I know that when we embarked upon this podcast, there was a little bit of debate. Should we do this? Should we not? Should we do it at the end? Should we do it at the beginning? But after we recorded our first official episode that we recorded, which is episode 2, the Rush inaugural album, we realized, we should probably set up the podcast series with a discussion about the various eras of Rush. And you've done some more homework on this than I have, and you put together a playlist, which I've yet to hear what is on your playlist for this first era. So why don't you sock it to me?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about the playlist that I made for Era 1, but do you want to talk about what we're defining as the eras first, and then, I'll talk about the first era, how I define the first era, and then I'll give you my playlist. We will link the playlist in Spotify in case, as you are doing your homework for listening to the next 4 or 5 episodes that we do, if you don't feel like you're quite ready to dive in and listen to every track on every record, which is certainly what I hope you'll do, this is at least a pretty good primer. So the way that I approach the eras is really quite conventional among Rush fans. I think that there is a general framework that people use, and I think is, at least from what I can tell from cruising the Rush subreddit and things like that, is probably the most common way of kind of framing their career. Rush in the early days, and by early I really mean the first 15 records or so, 15 studio records, had a pattern where they would do 4 records, 4 studio albums, and then a live album. And those 4 studio albums followed by the live album also pretty neatly encapsulate what they're doing musically, lyrically, kind of stylistically, instrumentally, and so that's really I think that is kind of the most effective framework for how to look at their eras. So the first era I refer to as the Bell Bottoms era. This is the very early part of their career in the mid 70s. This is kind of the early beginnings of Rush as kind of this prog metal 70s band. So I would call the Bell Bottom era the eponymous 1974 album Rush, 1975's Fly By Night, which is the first album that features Neil Peart, 1975's Caress of Steel, 1976's 2112, which is really kind of the breakout for Rush, certainly the breakout as kind of a well-loved prog band. And then the kind of period at the end of that era's sentence is 1976's live album, All the World's a Stage. I think
which if I recall, because there was a video of it, and you can find a lot of these videos on YouTube. All the World's a Stage was they weren't like they looked pretty normal on stage, like they weren't in their as you call them the space kimonos.
The space kimonos. So I think really as you get to kind of 2112 and right after 2112, they start to really embrace a slightly more glammy kind of inspired prog rock look. If you think about John Anderson in the mid to late 70s wearing, caftans and all kinds of stuff like that, Rush started to adapt a style that was a little bit like that in the at the height of their prog era, which I'll talk about in a second.
And but speaking of, yes, era, I actually just saw them last week, and I was talking with their manager after the show, and I gave him my proposed Rush eras, and he's a Canadian, and he thought it was he agreed with it to some degree. So we'll get to those in a bit.
Yeah, I think that, but anyway, that first era, the bell bottoms era, this is, the kind of bell bottom jeans and t-shirts, classic 70s metal rock music, kind of a look. I think of this era. Here are a few of the things that I think are kind of the hallmarks of this era. It is the last era of what I describe as fun Rush lyrics. After Neil Peart really kind of squeezes Geddy and Alex completely out of the kind of lyric writing in almost all situations and gets a little bit more heavy. You don't hear that many songs that are kind of like, hey baby, I like your style, like you see in some of the earlier Rush albums. This is a very Led Zeppelin influenced era. I think it's very difficult to argue that it isn't. This is really the height of the Zappa influence for the band. Well,
so in your Bell Bottoms era is the very last studio album in that era. That's Carousel of Steel, right?
No, it's 2112.
2112 is in the Bell Bottoms. Okay.
Yeah, it's in the Bell Bottoms era. But okay. I mean, it is kind of like, it's obviously a transitional record, but I think it's the end of the Bell Bottom era. Okay. Very Zappa influence, but they're beginning to find prog. The songs are getting a little bit more technically complex, a little bit longer, and you definitely are starting to see the kind of stereotypical 1970s fantasy, sci-fi, fable-y lyrical content. It is a very guitar forward era. It really is. Alex shines in this era, in my opinion. And this era, I think from a production perspective, is pretty raw. And it's Terry Brown. So Terry Brown is a longtime collaborator, producer of Rush. He kind of got co-producer credits with Rush for every album from Fly By Night through the end of this era, through 2112. He was involved as an engineer on the first Rush record, if I'm not mistaken, but he didn't get a producer credit. He did get producer and arranger credits on Fly By Night Onward. And I think this is a record that I think is really the first record where you very neatly can kind of fit them in with some of the contemporaries that people, generally think of, Genesis, Yes, like the kind of classic British prog music that was, a few years prior to Rush, but definitely contemporaries and maybe a little bit influential. Yeah, and so I think that this era is, this is really the band kind of finding its way to use to kind of use a Rush song reference. They're I think discovering their musicality, they're developing their technical prowess, and they're getting very interested in pushing that to kind of the outer limits. Yeah. And I also think Neil Peart is just kind of really spreading his wings in a kind of it's the rangiest, youngest sounding Neil Peart lyrics through this era. Well, and you know what? If you look at a lot of the lyrics in many of the songs from this first era, these first few albums, it's a lot of it is about being on the road and being away, like for the first time. So it seems that if we're looking at the context of what was going on in the band's lives and how it influenced their music, a lot of it was like, journeymen, wanderers. I mean, even like if you look at like the three travelers, men of Willowdale, emerge from the forest shadows, right? It's very much about we're on our own, finding our way, right? Eyes looking back from the window beside. I think that really reflects the practical reality of the band. I mean, this is an incredibly productive couple of years, but what's amazing to me is it really is only a couple of years. The first Rush album self-titled, came out in March of 74. The last studio record in this era came out in March of 76. So that's 4 studio records. And they were touring essentially nonstop in between all of these records. So the albums were recorded in, 2, 3, 4 weeks. I think I remember reading that 2112 was a 3-week studio time.
Well, what do we know about the songwriting process? I mean, were they writing in the studio? Were they recording demos? Were they recording or writing songs while they were on the road? Do we know much about this era, what their songwriting process was?
So again, I'm not I'm not going to claim to be the most perfect Rush historian, but from what I've read, most of these songs were kind of worked out while they were on the road. They were jamming during sound checks in hotel rooms. There's a lot of, from what I remember reading, there's a lot of 2112 that was worked out on a little pig nose amp between Alex and Geddy while they were just on the road in hotel rooms. And then they'd book studio time, knock it out, and hit the road again. But I mean, this is, this is Rush in their 20s, being single, just getting married. They're on the road all the time. They're really working hard. And honestly, this era is interesting because the progression from the first Rush album to 2112, I think, is staggering. And I don't think there's any other era of Rush that shows that much progression. Next era, at least in my framing, and what I think is the most common framing, is what I call Space Kimonos. It's 1977 to 1981. This is the height of Rush at its kind of prog rock stereotypicalness. There is some amazing records in here, but this is really kind of the I think for people who find prog rock, and in particular Gen 1 prog rock, again, Yes, Genesis, some of that stuff, find it to be a little bit, silly. I think this is in some ways the era that most perfectly fits into that stereotype. But in my assessment, I think some of the best records that Rush ever made are in this era. So it starts with September 1977 when they release A Farewell to Kings. October 78, Hemispheres. January 1980, Permanent Waves comes out. And then in February of 81, Moving Pictures comes out. And they kind of end this era with the release in October of 1981 of Exit Stage Left, another live record.
Yeah, legendary live record. And one of the things to point out, if you're not familiar with Rush or this era, if you just Google search Rush Kimonos, you have plenty of imagery that will crystallize in your head what we're talking about. There is an old interview where they asked, where did the space kimonos come from, or the kimonos? I don't think they call them space kimonos, but I think they are from outer space. They were traveling, they were on the road, and I guess they were on the West Coast. And trying to figure out, did they have a style, what their style was? And again, very much influenced by what was going on culturally in pop culture at the time, that you kind of had to have this style, like some sort of, stake in the ground as to who you were. They found these kimonos in a store in San Francisco, and that's how they adopted it.
Yeah, it is really, this look is something else. I think not only are the kimonos amazing, but Neil Peart's mustache during this era is absolutely epic. It is an amazing mustache. It goes with the kimono incredibly poorly, but they stuck with it. And so I think a few things are kind of hallmarks of this era. The first thing that I think is super, super important, the introduction of Moogs. The A Farewell to Kings is the first time the Taurus pedals show up, and the first time the Mini Moog shows up, or at least from what I can tell. and just expanded instrumentation much more generally. You see Neil Peart playing a lot more things like timpani and bells and, marimba or vibes or whatever it is. And I think all of the members of Rush start to noodle with instruments that are not their core instrument.
Yeah, I think another like a subtitle for this era could be the expanding kit era too. Not just the drum kit, but also Geddy's his synthesizers.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that the overall amount of amount going on in these songs really gets to be kind of staggering. It is, to the point that you just made in some ways, Raf. I think of this as the apex of Rush as a technically proficient band, musically proficient band, and a structurally complex band. And I would actually pinpoint, in my opinion, I think that the song where that hits its zenith is La Villa Strangiato.
Okay. I see where you're coming from. I think in this era, I'm going to add a little conflict and drama to this. I would disagree. I would say the like peak Rush in terms of complexity, in terms of showcasing the just the depth and breadth of what they're capable of, actually comes on the Power Windows album. I'll discuss that track when we get to that album, but there's a track on Power Windows which I think is like, if you had to like put Rush into a single song, this is the song. And it's a deeper catalog track. It's not like Tom Sawyer.
I can't wait to hear about it, Raf. Yeah. So La Villa, there's some interviews and things out there where they talk about the recording of La Villa specifically. They decided that they wanted to record that song in a single take. And
did they?
And in the end, they failed. In the end, they had to kind of cut in a couple of sections of the song, but their attempts to record that song in a single take took longer than the entire Caress of Steel album took to record. Which I think is just, pretty amazing.
Dedication, yeah.
So anyway, I just think it's this is really kind of the height of them at their proggiest. Lyrically, it is also, I think, the most out there in terms of classic prog tropes. There are certainly some songs that are a little bit more grounded, but generally speaking, I think they go the furthest into outer space, kind of figuratively and literally.
Like when Geddy's singing "Like a Spiral Symphony," right?
Yeah, I mean, Hemispheres, Permanent Waves. These are some very out there records lyrically.
And maybe we could talk a little bit briefly about the album art too. I mean, the album art too gets very surreal at this time too.
It does. I'm glad that you brought up album art, Raf. I would, to go back to the first era for a second. I think the album art across the first era of Rush is pretty bad. Generally, I think that there's a famous story about Caress of Steel, which is, I think, when we get into the individual album, we'll talk about this more. It's not a particularly well loved or respected Rush record, but one of the things about the record is when they originally designed the album art, it was supposed to have a metallic silver printing on it. Mm-hmm. And the printing got screwed up. And so it came out kind of this like bronzy, gold yellow, and they just never fixed it. But it doesn't make any sense that it's this kind of gold, metallic album cover when the name of the album is Caress of Steel. Anyway, I think there's a lot of...
I heard that story before, but I never connected the name of the album to the fact that it's not steel colored.
Yeah, I just think that the album covers in the first era are not great. They're in some cases they're bad, in some cases they're okay, like 2112, but they're never great. I think in the second Space Kimonos era, some really cool album covers. I think A Farewell to Kings is a great album cover. Actually, Raf, there's a Buffalo connection. Rafi and I both grew up in Buffalo, New York. The photo on the cover of A Farewell to Kings was a composite photo, and there's kind of a construction, like a demolition site, and there's a man, a jester, sitting in a chair. The Jester that was shot elsewhere, but the demolition site, the whole kind of wasteland, was shot in Buffalo. That was a site in downtown Buffalo.
Was it really?
Yeah. So Farewell to the Kings, great cover. Permanent Waves, I think, is a very good cover.
Yeah.
And Moving Pictures, I think, is a great cover. Hemispheres, I'm not as big a fan of that cover. But it does feature Naked Man's Ass, the second Rush album to feature a naked man ass.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think you could do a whole episode on just Naked Man, right? The main. Well, I mean, think about it. He's the icon of Rush. You know, the star with the circle with the naked man in it, right? He makes a couple of appearances, then he just sort of disappears.
Yeah,
like where did he go?
Well, are we sure he disappeared, or did he put clothes on and then maybe he's the same guy that's moving the pictures on the cover of Moving Pictures?
Well, he progressed. He found clothes,
just like Rush. So anyway, I think that your point is good. There's some really good album covers in this era. It's the first era where they recorded outside of Canada. So as soon as they got a little bit of success, being very influenced by a lot of the kind of first wave prog bands, which really mostly were from the UK, they made the decision to go and record outside of Ontario, basically, for the first time. And they recorded A Farewell to the Kings, Hemispheres. I'm not sure about Permanent Waves, but the first two albums in this were recorded in Wales. So I think that's a difference. The band is, has a little bit more scope because of their commercial success.
Well, and I know I know they admired bands like, Yes and Genesis, but they also listened to a lot of like post-punk music around this time too, right? That's something that I know Neil Peart talks about a lot, or talked about a lot. So, it's easy to forget that, these prog rock legends are listening to stuff other than prog rock and being influenced by it.
It's totally true. They talk a lot about the influence of the Police in particular in a number of different places.
Talking Heads as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think as you get toward the end of this era, Moving Pictures in particular, I mean, Moving Pictures is really the transitional album. A couple of things happen. You start to see significantly shorter songs, significantly more direct lyrics and personal lyrics, I would argue. I think that melodically, these are more melodically upfront songs towards the end of this era. And digital recording actually shows up for the first time in this era with Moving Pictures. It's the first time the band ever recorded digitally.
Yeah, if you're traveling through space, you gotta use computers, so it just makes sense.
Yeah, it's true. But the 48 track digital recording that they did in Moving Pictures apparently caused some delays for them, and was a little bit of a struggle, but something that they absolutely embraced in the next era.
Wait, was Moving Pictures recorded digitally?
Yeah.
Are you sure? Because I thought the first album to be recorded digitally was Yes Union in 1990. Yeah.
So Moving Pictures, first 48 track recording, and also the first using digital. Roth, you were talking about Yes, the first kind of pure digital recording.
Union was the first, from what I understand, the first time an album was recorded to hard disk. So digital is obviously very broad, right? So in Power Windows, or Moving Pictures rather, it was recorded 48 track analog from what we understand, but it was mastered to digital 3/4 inch tape. So yes, digital, not hard drive. It's funny because today we think, when you're recording digitally, it's just going to hard drive, of course, right? But it's very different. We forget that there was digital tape.
Digital tape, yeah, sure. That was what, Roth, when you and I were in high school and recording, the height of technology for us was
DATs. Yeah,
right?
gotta love that. I mean, it's all ones and zeros. That's what's important.
So anyway, I think though the through line here is by the end, both at the beginning of this era and at the end of the era, you see Rush really embracing technology, embracing new technology from the kind of Taurus pedals and the Moogs and kind of early synths to new recording techniques and new they're really kind of becoming gearheads in a way that is not as noticeable in the first era. But that takes us very kind of cleanly into 82 to 87, which I refer to as the Skinny Ties era. This is stylistically, I think aesthetically, we see some haircuts. Neil all of a sudden cuts his hair pretty short. Geddy starts to move towards the schlong kind of look. And as does Alex, and they lose the kimonos and they start to dress much more like most of the kind of early 80s new wave bands that I think they were really influenced by during this era. So the first record here is 1982's Signals, followed by April of 84, Grace Under Pressure, October of 1985, Power Windows, and the final studio album in this era in the Skinny Ties era is September 87, Hold Your Fire. And the live album that kind of caps this one off is 1989's A Show of Hands.
Yeah.
So sorry, go ahead, Ralph.
I was just going to say Grace Under Pressure, I believe, was the first album they did without Terry Brown.
Yeah, so let's talk about the change in producers. So this album is the end of the Terry Brown era. Yeah. And they actually have a couple of different producers. The first one that they move on to from Terry Brown is Peter Henderson. Who is Peter Henderson? I had the same question. Who is this Peter Henderson guy, and why did they end up with him? Well, there are a couple of reasons. So the first thing is they originally approached or had some conversations with Trevor Horn. Trevor Horn at this time was in the band Yes. But he actually spent a very short period of time taking over for John Anderson as the singer of Yes. He was only in Yes for a couple of years.
He was in the Buggles.
He was best known for Video Killed the Radio Star, the Buggles. But Trevor Horn went on to be an incredibly influential producer. And some people, especially kind of in the UK kind of music industry, will say that Trevor Horn invented the 80s. He was involved with a lot of really influential early 80s kind of I want to say
he certainly ushered it in with MTV, right?
Video so the Radio Star. He was involved. If you look up Trevor Horn, he was involved in a lot of really interesting bands that actually hold together with the Buggles much better than the fact that he was in Yes for a couple of years and he produced Rush. But Peter, so they approached Trevor Horn. That it didn't work out right away. They ended up selecting Peter Henderson, who was he worked with Wings. He worked with Paul McCartney pretty consistently over the course of Paul McCartney's post-Beatles career. But I think the album that he produced that kind of stuck out to me as perhaps most important and I don't know this, but it seems like it could have been important in Rush's decision, was he produced Breakfast in America by Supertramp, which is an amazing record, kind of an American, somewhat prog album that's pretty contemporary to this era and a great sounding album, in my opinion. So Peter
and I think that's important. So if you look at Signals and Grace Under Pressure, they're clearly a very transformational era in Rush where they move more towards synths and whatnot. And I think it's easy to say that, the absence of Terry Brown brought them into that synth age, but there's enough of consistency, especially with the use of synthesizers, the change of songwriting between Signals and Grace Under Pressure, that I think indicate that it was the band driving that change, not the producers. Like if you look at like Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois, what they did with U2 with like The Unforgettable Fire, vastly different U2. And I think that the producers had way more of an imprint on a band like U2 than they did necessarily on Rush. So I think the producer was almost like a fourth team member, not the one sort of steering the ship, which I think is an important thing to note when it comes to Rush, how much they were very much involved with their progression.
Yeah, and I really do think when you look at the transitional albums like Moving Pictures, you can see a direction that they're going. So I do think that it's pretty evident when you listen to the albums in sequence that it isn't necessarily producer driven. Instead, they found producers that they felt like would be a good match for the direction that they wanted to go. So they started.
I think it was Rick Rubin, right? Who I know when you think music producer, you think Rick Rubin. But one of the things he said that I think really crystallized, the role of a producer. That he just articulated it very well. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said, the producer is the advocate for the audience, right? They're really there to make sure that what's going down, what's being mixed, how the band's recording, that it's something that listeners want to hear. So they're really sort of that sort of eyes from outside, making sure, giving sort of perspective to what they're doing. And I think that, Rush's producers writ large have been very good at doing that.
So yeah, Raf, I think that there are definitely different types of when I think of producers, I think there are different types of producers, right? There are purely kind of technical enabler producers. There are the Rick Rubin type of maybe audience advocate guru type producers. And then there are producers that tend to take on or seem to take on quite a bit of authorship and influence the band musically in a very noticeable way. I think the producer that I think of that's a good example of this is John Bryan. If you know John Bryan, he has produced a number of kind of more indie singer-songwriter albums, although he's been involved in records by people like Mac Miller, this like rapper, but worked with Elliott Smith, worked with Fiona Apple. And the albums that he worked on tend to have a John Bryan feel. Like there's instrumentation, there's arrangement. It really feels like it's almost as much a John Bryan album as it is the original artist. And so you can look at his catalog, although it's kind of across different artists, and there's a lot of similarities.
Kind of like a David Foster too. I mean, use undeniably David Foster if he's produced something.
Yeah, but I think Rush, there isn't really that isn't really present across their career. The producers kind of come and go, and I think they use certain producers in certain eras. But I don't really think you can attribute too much of what's happening with the band and their sound to the producer. Obviously, this is my own kind of fan speculation, but that's the way I feel.
Well, and that's exactly what I was saying, is that it's the band that's driving the progression of Rush, of the music.
Exactly. And then the last to kind of put a period on the end of the producer conversation, Peter Collins comes into the fold for the first time during this era. Peter Collins, prior to working with Rush, really not a lot of big producer credits. The biggest producer credits that I could see that were recognizable were actually Tracy Ullman, who went on to be kind of a comedian. That's what I know.
She was produced what?
Records. Apparently Tracy Ullman was like a singer or something. And I don't know anything about it, but Peter Collins produced a number of records from her in the kind of late 70s, early 80s that I have never heard a bit about, but that seems...
it could have been like skit comedy. I don't know. I mean, she's talented, multi-talented, so I could see that, but it's surprising.
Who knows? But Peter Collins really kind of works with Rush quite a bit during this era and their next era.
And where does this one end? This ends in
so this ends with Hold Your Fire, and then A Show of Hands is the live album, so 1989.
Well, so Hold Your Fire, interesting, because Amy Mann makes an appearance on that too.
Amy Mann makes an appearance, which is, I think, fitting given their interest in kind of new wave and poppier music, electronic music at this time. But this is, as you said, Rafi, probably the most defining characteristic in this era is that keyboards really take the lead in terms of instrumentation from guitar. And this is really kind of across the board a keyboard-driven era, in my opinion, and one that actually caused quite a bit of friction, from what I understand, between Alex Lifeson and Geddy Lee. it's also, you hear a lot of reggae influence and a lot of Police influence in this era, and a lot of world music influence. And you also just, I think, see an end of all of the stereotypically prog rock type lyrics. There's no more fables, no more stories about being in space and things like that. This is really a much more kind of
the pendulum has swung. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's no better illustration of that. And maybe this is a good segue into the next era, other than that, the fact that this era that you labeled the skinny tie era ends with the song Taishan, which even like by Rush's own admission is like, what the fuck? Where did that come from?
We'll talk about that one in detail when we get to Hold Your Fire. So next era, 1989 to 1997, or 1998, is what I call the Black Tees era. This is really Rush getting back into making guitar-driven rock music, metal, almost, metal, prog metal music, light metal music. I don't know how you want to describe it, but this is guitar driven music. So it starts with 1989's Presto, 1991 Roll the Bones, 1993 Counterparts, 1996 Test for Echo, and then it ends with 1998's live album Different Stages.
So, and I think this is an important thing because we want to bring some personal context into this discussion. This was the first album. This era begins with Presto, which was the first Rush album to come out while we were in high school, right? Which is a pretty formative time to buy an album, listen to an album. And I do remember, the first Rush album that I was like a Rush fan that I recall coming out was Hold Your Fire, right? Where I was aware of Rush. I had a bunch of albums. It was the first one where, I waited in line for tickets to go see the concert. But that was in middle school, but it was in high school when Presto came out. And I remember it was a pretty big deal that was made, that this is Rush's return to guitar driven rock.
Yeah, Rafi, I remember. So this is, again, on the personal level, we really had become very good friends. We're starting to kind of play music together. My recollection is that we saw Rush prior to Presto coming out on the what would have been Hold Your Fire tour. Yeah. I remember listening to A Show of Hands,
the red t-shirts.
Yeah. I mean, that was really this was the high point of my Rush fandom, was right in the, 8th grade, 9th grade kind of area. I absolutely loved them. And so when Presto came out, I remember the same thing, a tremendous amount of anticipation. I remember there was a lot of discussion about how much different this record was than kind of the previous 3 or 4 records. It really does sound and feel substantially different than the previous 4 studio albums. I will also say, though, towards the end of this era, this is where Rush kind of lost me. And I think that was both a reflection of kind of my age and evolving musical tastes, kind of getting ready to graduating from high school and getting into a very, very, I got into a very, very different type of music around that time. And so as we go through album by album and do our re-listen, I really, I know Counterparts. I've probably listened to Counterparts, a handful of times in my life. I have never listened to Test for Echo, and I have never listened to any of the subsequent albums after it. But I'm looking forward to kind of experiencing those for the first time, especially because I know the other 15 Rush albums so well, like the back of my hand.
Yeah. No, and again, the Counterparts, Test for Echo happened in college, right? And same thing for me. If you look at what was going on musically at the time, so in the summer before Presto came out, I recall it vividly, right? We'd be jamming in your garage or hanging out in your basement bedroom and watching MTV, and it'd be like Great White and Motley Crue or Aerosmith, in that later era for a lot of those bands. And it was very hair metal-y, kind of like, it was kind of like peak hair metal time. Like it was what was giving birth to grunge, right, in the Pacific Northwest, where people were like, we need something different. I think throughout high school, these Rush albums for me were sort of like a salvation from what was happening in the mainstream music at the time, and I listened to them a lot. Yeah, but when college hit, grunge was in full swing. Now, granted, I know we went to different geographies for that time of our lives, but I stayed in Western New York, and at the time, what really grabbed me was CFNY and what was happening on the Canadian music scene, which was very distinct and separate from what was happening on like K-Rock, let's say, or in the grunge scene in the United States. Yeah. So I fully went into like, Tea Party, Sarah McLachlan, Bare Naked Ladies, Our Lady Peace, right? A lot of those bands that were coming out of Canada, which were, from Rush's home turf. CFNY was supposedly, it was CFNY that Neil Peart was referring to in The Spirit of Radio. Begin the day with a friendly voice was, CFNY DJs. So that's when I sort of started to get pulled away from Rush and into what was happening in Canada at the time, more specifically.
It's kind of interesting. As I read through, lots of information about Rush and preparing to kind of do this with you. One of the things that struck me was them talking about when they were about that age, 18, late teens, and they were starting to play in bands and stuff. They would drive from Toronto to Buffalo to get the cool stuff. They would have to drive to Buffalo to buy Beatle boots. Is one thing that I said. And so for them, Buffalo was kind of the gateway to the American and UK kind of pop music scene and style scene that they didn't get as much in Canada. Whereas I think when you and I grow up, Buffalo is really in a lot of ways economically hollowed out and a real backwater. And Toronto was like the closest big cool city. And so when we would want to kind of experience something that was cool and felt a little bit more cosmopolitan, we would end up driving up to Toronto.
Yeah. Or even Fort Erie.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Different kind of culture.
Falls. But and also the drinking age was a couple years younger. So that made it a lot easier for a couple of 19-year-olds to go get some beers.
And so to just kind of finish off the eras for me, again, as I said, I can't really describe these records stylistically. So I'm really kind of leveraging the work of lots of different people, smart Rush fans on the internet.
I would say, so stylistically, what I recall from this era was very crisp, clean, but guitar driven. So yes, it was a return to the guitar driven music of early Rush, but it wasn't as analog. It was definitely more digital, definitely mastered for CDs, definitely very crisp, very clean kind of sound, like the drums. That's what I recall from this era. I think that now we haven't gotten to the next era, but when you get to Vapor Trails, again, the pendulum goes in the complete opposite direction, so much so that they had to remaster that album. Right. Yeah. Which again, we'll get to that. That's a whole other story in and of itself. But this era, definitely, I think, crisp, clean, return to guitar driven rock, but in a much more contemporary, sort of adult contemporary kind of style.
Yeah, I think that those last three records. So this is 2002's Vapor Trails, 2007's Snakes and Arrows, and 2012's Clockwork Angels, which worked out to be the final Rush album, or at least it looks like it's going to be the final Rush album, studio album. Those albums, I think, are, you can kind of bucket them into their own era. I think that the way to think about those records, or at least the way that I think about those records, is Rush has kind of achieved everything it wants to achieve. Neil Peart's going through a lot of personal turmoil with the loss of his daughter and wife. The band takes a number of kind of extended breaks during this era. Mm-hmm. And I think that these albums are them getting together kind of when they feel inspired, putting some, making a record that feels good at the time. But it's a little bit more of a hobby than it is a vocation at this point, and they're doing it because they love it rather than, you know, having a, not that they didn't love it before, but I think there's a little bit more of a commercial and professional drive and kind of momentum that's maintained through all the other eras.
Yeah.
So those are my eras, Ralph. I'd love to hear kind of how you think about it and pepper you with my questions.
I think there's just one era. It's the Rush era, and it's the 21st century. It's actually the 23rd century, but we'll discuss that in the 24th century. No, so I think we covered a lot of the details, so we don't have to spend much time on mine. But I took a little bit more of a non-traditional approach to the eras, and I didn't do it just to be contrary, right? There's nothing more annoying than someone who's contrary for the sake of being contrary. But it really was just that I never really thought about it until we decided to do this podcast. So when I actually sat down and thought about what are the real Rush eras, I realized, okay, well, typically we break them down on albums, but I wanted to look at the band as a whole from their formation in 1968 until they disbanded officially in 2015, 2016. And so my first era starts with 2016 and it goes through just one album, which was the eponymous Rush album, right? So I call that the birth era. And this is them hanging out in their parents' basements with like John Rutsey's older brother saying, "Hey, dude, why don't you call yourself Rush?" Right? "Sure, man." Right? So it's sort of like that, the birth of the band. And it culminates to me with the recording of their, I think it was 3 singles that they recorded, like Not Fade Away. And there was another song I can't recall. I mentioned it on the next episode, so tune into the next episode and you'll hear. And then it culminates with the recording of the Rush album, them getting a recording contract and going on their first tour. I don't know, did they tour with Kiss on that first tour?
I'm not sure if it was the first tour. It was one of their early tours, though. They were with Kiss.
I think that's so awesome that they toured with Kiss, by the way. That's like, it was like a match. That's like peanut butter and chocolate. So that's my first era. It goes back to really early Rush. And the reason why I did that is because the second era, like for me, like Neil Peart joining the band is such a seismic event in Rush's history and such a consequential event that it needs to be its own, ushering in its own era. So the second era I have is what I'm calling Adolescence, right? And it really it's 1 year, 1975, and includes 2 albums, right? And those albums are, Fly By Night and Caress of Steel. And I can even pinpoint it in Caress of Steel. It's like halfway through Caress of Steel, they go into the next era, right? So the first 3 tracks, Bastille Day, Lakeside Park, I Think I'm Going Bald, and Lakeside Park, are uniquely of the adolescent era, right? It includes lyrics as deep as I Think I'm Going Bald. But then you get into the Necromancer, you get into their long sort of rock operas, which I think is like the really good. It's like that album. I mean, I'll get into it, what I think about it when we get to that album, but it's like I don't know what a good analogy is. It's sort of like, the first 3 tracks are the appetizers, and then like the last 2 tracks are like the main course, right? And you're having like an experience, like experiential dining. So that adolescent era is really Fly By Night and the first half of Caress of Steel. Then we get into what I'm calling the exploration era. And this is where, like,
wait a second, Rob, are you splitting an era halfway in a record?
I am. And you can sue me if you don't like that.
I love it. I love it. Granular. It's surgical, your era.
Well, it solves a key problem, which is like, where do you fit those, and I think this like speaks to how quickly Rush was evolving at this time too, right? They were evolving in real time, like right before our eyes. And then the next era is what I'm calling exploration. And you mentioned La Villa Strangiato. I think that is peak exploration Rush, right? Okay. Where it's the closest thing to jazz that Rush has on any of their albums, right? I mean, it actually has a jazz sequence in it. There's some like jazz bass solos, right? So the exploration period for me is up through it goes up through All the World's a Stage, right? Mm-hmm. And then we have the next era I'm calling the application era. And what do I mean by application? It's the application of their exploration, right? It starts with what has become the quintessential Rush album, which is Moving Pictures. And I think that is the first time where we're seeing Rush become this is the band they've always meant to be. Everything that came before it. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, just why I have a question. You said that you think Moving Pictures is the quintessential Rush album.
I didn't say I think that's what's become known as the quintessential Rush album.
Oh, yeah. See, that's interesting. I just think that it seems to me as time has progressed and more distance, we have more distance between kind of Rush's career and today. I feel like 2112 has kind of become the album that most people refer to. But maybe that's wrong. I mean, maybe that's wrong. I do think for a long time, Moving Pictures really was seen as the I think it was the commercially at the time the most successful Rush record, and certainly has the most commercially successful song on it in Tom Sawyer. But
well, I mean, we talked earlier about how that first era is them like finding their way, traveling. Yeah. So to continue that, geographic sort of analogy, I would say, in my opinion, 2112 is when they found their bearing, right? Where they're like, okay, we know what direction we want to go in now, and we're going to follow this heading.
Yep.
And I think that Moving Pictures is when they finally arrived, and they're like, okay, this is Rush. This is who we are. And then they started to apply new technologies, and this is when they progress, and they kind of like, again, one of the themes that is coming out in this conversation is that Rush is a pendulum, right? They keep going back and forth, right? They get really into. I'm assuming, and you know what? If you look at someone like Geddy Lee and his like collection of baseballs, right? It seems that the guys in Rush don't do anything halfway. Right. Neil will, if he wants to get into a book or literature, he goes in. If he wants to go on a motorcycle trip, he gets like fully into it. If Geddy wants to get in collecting something, like he will get into it. If Alex wants to be a goofball and party, he will do that. So much so he'll get arrested and it will make the national news. So I think that these guys don't do anything halfway. And I think that's really comes to light when you're breaking it down by era. So in this application era, they're applying new technologies to this format of the band that is Rush. And I think this is where they really, the songs become much more complex. And like I said earlier, there's a song on Power Windows, which I'll reveal it on the Power Windows episode, that I think is sort of peak Rush.
Ooh, I can't wait.
The complexity of the songwriting. It has guitars, it has synths, it's drums. Even if you get down to the individual like instrumentation of it, like it's like peak Geddy, peak Alex, peak Neil, right?
Yeah.
And then I think what as the pendulum sort of came to a head at the end of this era, they go to the next era, which I'm calling the back to basics era, which is, and I think we both agree that this era begins with Presto. And it ends with Counterparts. So it's sort of the end. We just discussed this like 5 minutes ago, so I'm not going to get into it, but I will say, and this is something that may be a controversial or hot take, I think Rush's final album is Counterparts, right? I think like the last like truly Rush album where they're a band, where they're cranking out albums every year, where they're like it's a concerted effort. Like I think they sort of achieve that with Counterparts. Yeah. And the other reason why I think it's the band's last album is because, especially with the personal tragedy in Neil Peart's life and his taking a extended break from the band, I think the band was never the same. And I'm not saying that in a bad way, because I do have a lot of complimentary things to say about their later albums. But I think that the band as they existed from Fly By Night, like Fly By Night to Counterparts, to me is like Rush. Like that's the heart. That's like the artichoke heart of Rush, right? The first album is the stem, and everything else is sort of like the leaves around it. But like the heart of Rush is Fly By Night to Counterparts. Yeah. So the next era is what I'm calling the Abyss. Right. Because it really was. I mean, for the band, for Neil Peart in particular, it was a very dark time of personal growth, of scarring, of healing. And this era ends with an album that is the original album that was recorded of Vapor Trails was a sonic abyss. I mean, if you had to put a a sound to like a musical sound to what an abyss would sound like. That's the original version of Vapor Trails. I don't know if you can find, if you don't have the original version, I think they buried it. They got rid of it. Very dark, booming album, right?
It's when you talk about Vapor Trails, it was produced by a guy named Paul Northfield, another British producer, well known for working with a number of kind of late, I guess you'd call it second or third wave progressive bands. So Dream Theater, Queensryche, Porcupine Tree. These are all kind of later, I don't know if it's second or third wave, but later wave prog bands.
Yeah. Well, it sort of caps the Abyss period, right? But it also is a rebirth. I guess you could call it Rebirth, because I had Birth was the first era. This could be Rebirth. Because they had Ghost Rider was one of the tracks on it, which was a very personal song, obviously, to Neil Peart. He wrote the book, also called Ghost Rider, which was a great book. I mean, it's like, if you ever experience, this is just some unsolicited advice, but especially if you're someone who, whether you're a person of faith or not, I think both of these books are sort of chicken soup for the soul. If you're ever going through a hard time, there are two books that I think I will certainly read, touch wood that it doesn't happen at least anytime soon. One is Neil Peart's Ghost Rider. Just going through the experience of healing from, just this unthinkable tragedy, losing his daughter and wife within a matter of months. But also there's Tim Russert wrote a book called Big Russ and Me, which also has a lot of life learnings from his father. So those two books, unsolicited advice, hopefully it makes the cut in this podcast, but that you should read. So The Abyss is this era. It ends with Vapor Trails. I don't know when they remixed Vapor Trails and re-released it, but that was part of the final era of Rush, which I am calling, let me get to it, personal growth, right? I might even call this Rebirth, right? So that's 2002 to 2011. Now, what happens in this era of Rush? Well, first of all, they have far fewer releases, right? So, I mean, there's like 5 years between their last three albums. So Vapor Trails comes out in 2002. Then you have Snakes and Arrows, which comes out in 2007, which I was actually working at Universal Music when this was released. That came out in Atlantic. And then Clockwork Angels comes out in 2012. So these albums, sorry, I had a little bit of interference there. These albums, to me, especially Snakes and Arrows and Clockwork Angels, are much more like literary, right, than they are musical. I think they're really, Neil Peart is really driving the creative direction on these albums. I may be wrong. So this is just from a fan's point of view. I feel that they're really Neil Peart's sort of like outlets, his return to quote normal life, it's sort of a sign of things to come, where the band's looking to wind it down. Neil Peart's going to be embarking upon a writing career, writing science fiction novels and whatnot. And I think the band at this stage in their life are like, we have nothing to prove. We've got our lives. We want to, spend time with our families. We still love the band. We still have this camaraderie as a band. But like, let's do music when we find it inspiring. Like, there's no rush, pardon the pun, to release an album. And I think that this last era, and to be sure, the whole studio discography of Rush ends with the last track on Clockwork Angels, The Garden, right? And I don't want to jump ahead to The Garden, but I will say, again, to give it personal context, the last time I saw Rush play live was on that tour, and it was at the Universal Amphitheater in Universal City, which is no longer exists. It's Harry Potter land now. But it was a unique venue in that you could be at the stage level, like in the bleachers, and be like very close to the stage. And we had like center front row of that next level up. So we were like, it was the perfect vantage point to see Rush play, and you can't get it in any other venue. You certainly can't get it at like a hockey arena or which is what their typical venue is. And I remember The Garden being the last track they played on that tour. And it was just, if you listen to the lyrics of it, right, it is like, to me, it's like the ultimate, like, last track. Like, it encapsulates, I know it's the story of Clockwork Angels, but it encapsulates, to me, Rush, their entire career. And I almost feel it's like Neil Peart saying goodbye with that song. Not personally, but as a band. I feel that The Garden was an intentional, this is our last song off our last album, we're saying goodbye now. And that was the last time I saw Rush. And I did have last minute tickets to see their last album, their last gig in Los Angeles, their very last live performance. And I didn't go to it, right? Because I didn't feel like dealing with, I regret it, but I didn't go to it because they were like nosebleeds, and like I didn't feel like dealing with it, whatever it was. But I don't regret it, because my last imagery of Rush live was just, you couldn't top it. Like, you just couldn't top it. Yeah.
You had a great last experience. I'm really looking forward to actually listening to these records, and especially given what you've said about Clockwork Angels, it's going to be cool to listen to new Rush material for the first time for me in 20 years or something. So yeah, I'm looking forward to digging deep into those albums. I think one of the things when you think about the eras of Rush, just the fact that we can have an in-depth conversation about this topic is pretty amazing. I think one of the coolest things about Rush, and over the course of the next many podcast episodes, we will go into excruciating detail about all of this, but this band has evolved so much over such a long period of time and such a huge body of work. And there are not a lot of bands that have, number one, stuck around as long as Rush had. Number two, were as productive as Rush was for as long a period of time as they were. And number three, evolved so much with what I think is by and large success. I have my preferences about which albums and which eras I prefer. But so I'll say I don't like the Skinny Ties era as much as I like the Space Kimono era, personally.
Yeah.
But they did something within the Skinny Ties era that I think is mostly successful. Across all of these eras, there are songs and even records that are not as, don't hold up as well. There are some songs that I will argue are real stinkers and shouldn't have been included on records. And Rush would say the same thing about a couple of songs across their career, as I'm sure any creative person, who's not a complete egotist would say about their output. But it really is amazing how much these three people have been able to stick together and evolve together creatively and continue to be productive over such a long period of time. It's a pretty
and remain friends, remain so close as well.
There was one personnel change in the history of the band, and that was after the first record, and there were no other personnel changes. Think about any band. I mean, a band that, Rafi, you and I have talked about.
U2 goes back even further though. Like, I mean, U2, they're like middle school, high school. The original lineup has always been U2.
Yeah, that is true. And now, actually, U2 is an interesting candidate for, assuming anybody listens to backtracking, what's the next band that we're going to cover? I think we've talked about Genesis. I think U2 is another really good example. Genesis is a band that has existed for a tremendously long period of time, or did exist for a tremendously long period of time, evolved a tremendous lot over the course of their career, and had creative highlights and lowlights and substantially different styles of music over the course of that career. However, the personnel for Genesis changed a lot over that period of time, right? And so in some ways, I think you could make the argument it isn't even really the same band. The band that did Nursery Crime is not the same band that did I don't know, one of the
Weekend Dance.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it really, there's really just not that much similar just in terms of personnel. So the stylistic and creative changes are not as surprising. Whereas Rush, this is, these are the same guys playing more or less the same instruments, over a 30-year period, but they really evolved a lot, which I think is, an amazing and almost perfectly unique thing within the history of rock music.
Well, and there's a time, and I know you probably feel the same, and I know a lot of our listeners who are Rush fans feel the same way. There are different seasons, different moods, states of mind where you want to reach for an album or a track from one of these eras, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, especially as I've gotten older, I appreciate the lyrics of Rush as almost like a secular Bible of sorts, right? There are situations you encounter, feelings, emotions, family politics, work, what's going on in the world. And you can find answers, or if not an answer, you can find a sympathetic tale in the lyrics of Rush, right? And to a remarkable extent too.
Yeah, I also very personally, I think one of the things about this project that we're doing together, Rafi, that really has me excited is there is. I wish I had the capability to kind of pull the neuroscience to the front of my mind really quickly, but I've heard, I'm probably going to misstate it, but I've heard that there is a period of time in your life, in your kind of early teens through early 20s, where your brain is literally changing in such a way that explains why the music that you dive into during that time ends up being the most influential music and the music that you kind of remember for your entire life. Mm-hmm. For me, Rush is definitely one of those bands. I dove into Rush with you and with some of our other friends so deeply in my early and kind of mid-teens that I feel like I know it all so well, and it is so emotionally evocative for me, not just kind of lyrically and musically, but just kind of from a memory perspective. I can put on signals and have this difficult to identify the specific memory that it's evoking, but it gives me this incredible sense of kind of reminiscence and it's always a fun and emotional kind of experience to go back through these records. So doing it to you now that we're like old men, or doing it with you now that we're like old men, going back through all of this together, I think is going to be really fun because
but that's interesting.
A lot of those feelings.
Because one of the things you didn't say is nostalgic, right? And I'm not at all a nostalgic person. I hate nostalgia, right? It's depressing to me. I would rather think about what's next to the future, right? Yet Rush it's something familiar, like it does take you back, but at the same time, it's very present. It's not like you're regressing into like, oh, how I felt when I was 12, 14, 15 years old. It does evoke some of those, feelings of nostalgia, but when you listen to the lyrics, right, they're very cerebral. Like you're always discovering something new, that your perspective in life, has the lyrics mean something a little bit different, or and this happens constantly, you listen to a lyric and it finally dawns on you what the lyric is talking about, and you're like, oh my God, like I've been listening to this song for years, and it's something completely new that I've discovered in the lyrics that I never thought of before, right?
Yeah. So
that's what's to me is why Rush remains relevant, and it really just thrills me to see videos of like, 10-year-olds, drumming to Rush songs or playing bass to Rush songs or guitar, whatever they are, discovering who they are and really appreciating what is a timeless catalog of music and words and lyrics.
No, it's absolutely true. I am nostalgic to quote Noah Baumbach from Kicking and Screaming, one of my favorite movies.
Yeah, great movie.
I'm nostalgic about things that happened yesterday. So I am nostalgic, and I definitely will feel some nostalgia as I go through these albums. But what I will say, as I've been listening to Rush again quite a lot, again in prep for doing this with you, is that I don't. There may be many people who would disagree with me on this, but I don't feel like the music is dated. I feel like Rush was, in most situations, so unique and apart from kind of the mainstream that they always just sound like Rush. They never really sound like anything else. And so it's a little bit harder to date them, if that makes sense. You can date the albums relative to another Rush album, but it's really difficult to kind of listen to Permanent Waves and say like, oh, this sounds exactly like all the other records that came out that year. It doesn't, they never do.
Yeah, the only thing I could really date them on is probably it's funny, it's a quintessential Rush album, but like Camera Eye, for example, there's some songs where there is this and I don't know if it was a Canadian thing, because you always hear it in like Canadian programming from that era, like late 70s, early 80s. But there is this sort of Moog synth kind of sound that's the only time where, like, to me, it's dated to not just an era, but like Canada.
Yeah.
Right? And sorry, Canadians, but like, you know what I'm talking about if you know that era. Like if you watch like a science show from like 1979, 1980 from like the CBC, like you'll hear those type of synths. Right? Yeah. But even like in the Skinny Tie era, the synths are not like, they don't evoke the 80s necessarily for me, even though they're very 80s. They're very timeless.
Yeah, it's interesting. You can really listen to, well, I mean, we're going to dig into this, but I think in the Skinny Tie era, you can hear the influence of early 80s new wave bands, but the way that it's kind of, to make a pun, synthesized by Rush and output, it doesn't end up sounding, it's not like, you listen to Grace Under Pressure and it sounds like The Fix or, you know what I mean? It doesn't sound quite the same as any of these other bands. It just sounds singular. And so I think it does give it many of these songs a timeless quality. Now, again, as we go track by track, there are a number of songs that I think we can pick out and say, yeah, this was kind of this one didn't quite get there, or this one really doesn't hold up. I've definitely experienced that in some of my re-listens, but the songs that work just as well today as they did 20, 30 years ago, in my opinion. And in some cases better. So I'm really looking forward to going through everything in detail.
Well, on that note, join us next time where we go through Rush's eponymous album, Rush, where we get into it, right?
Yeah, and check out the show notes. We will have links to reference material. We'll have links to Spotify playlists that Raf and I put together for those of you who want to kind of have a cheat sheet and not listen to every record, not listen to every song, but want to get a sense of the progression of the band over the course of these eras.
As always, thank you for listening to the Backtracking Podcast Rush Edition. Dan, why don't you tell the folks where they can find us online?
Folks, you can find us online at Instagram or X. Our handle, our username is at Backtracking Rocks, ROX. That's at Backtracking Rocks. We want to hear from you, so follow, send us a message with a correction, a request, or just some kind of love poem. And spread the word.